The morning the Duke of Ashford told Marion Voss to sit with the servants at his sister's engagement dinner, she did not argue. She did not flush with shame. She did not look at the floor the way women in her position were expected to. She simply looked at him, just for a moment, just long enough, with the kind of stillness that belongs to people who have already survived the worst thing that could happen to them. Then she smoothed her plain gray dress, picked up her plate, and walked to the far end of the room without a word. Across the table, a boy with the Duke's exact jaw and his mother's dark eyes watched his father without blinking. The Duke did not notice the boy. He never did. He had absolutely no idea the boy existed. The rain had started somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd mile out of the village, and by the time Marion Voss arrived at Hartwell House, her traveling coat was soaked through at the shoulders, and her boots had taken on water at the left heel. She had not complained about this to anyone, because there was no one to complain to. The cart driver had dropped her at the gate with a nod and turned his horse around before she had even lifted her bag from the back. She stood there for a moment in the gray afternoon, looking up at the house, wide, pale stone, ivy climbing the east wing, every window glowing faintly with the kind of warmth that belongs to people who have never had to wonder where they would sleep. She picked up her bag and walked around to the servants' entrance. Not because anyone had told her to. She had simply learned over the years that it was better to know which door was yours before someone else made a point of showing you. The housekeeper, a stout woman named Mrs. Graves, opened the door before Marion had finished knocking. She looked her up and down the way experienced housekeepers do, quickly, thoroughly, and without any particular expression. "Miss Voss," she said, "it was not a question." "Yes." "You're late." The rain delayed the cart. Mrs. Graves stepped aside to let her in. "Lady Ashford expected you this morning. She's been asking since noon." She said this without accusation, simply as a fact that Marion would now be required to carry. "I'll go to her directly," Marion said, "if you'll just show me where." "You'll dry off first." Mrs. Graves was already moving down the corridor. "I won't have you dripping on Lady Ashford's carpets, and the boy needs feeding. He's been in the kitchen for the past hour asking cook whether scones count as supper." Marion almost smiled. "Almost. That sounds about right," she said and followed. James was sitting at the kitchen table with a scone in each hand and flour on his left cheek, engaged in what appeared to be a very serious conversation with one of the kitchen maids about whether horses dreamed. He was 6 years old. He had her eyes in someone else's jaw, and an absolutely unshakable confidence in his own opinions that Marion had never quite managed to trace back to herself. She knew where it came from, she simply did not say so. "Mama," he said it without looking up, the way children do when they have somehow sensed a parent entering a room before anyone else has noticed. Then he did look up, assessed her wet coat and her tired face, and held out one of the scones. "Cook says these are not supper. I think she is wrong." "Cook is not wrong," Marion said. She took the scone anyway, sat down beside him, and let herself, just for a moment, feel the warmth of the kitchen, the smell of bread and coal fire, the particular relief of having arrived somewhere after a long time of moving. "Is this where we're going to live?" James asked. "For a while." "Is it a good place?" Marion looked around the kitchen. Mrs. Graves was speaking quietly to one of the maids. Outside the small window, the rain was still coming down. Somewhere above them, in the bright warm rooms she had seen from the gate, Lady Ashford was waiting. "I think it could be," she said carefully. James considered this with the gravity of someone who has learned that his mother chooses her words precisely. "All right," he said, and went back to his scone. Lady Ashford, Charlotte, younger sister of the Duke of Ashford, 3 weeks from her own wedding, turned out to be exactly the kind of woman Marion had hoped for and slightly feared. She was 24, quick-eyed and warm in the distracted way of people whose minds move faster than their manners. She apologized for the rain as though she were personally responsible for it. She asked after James immediately and seemed genuinely pleased to hear he had opinions about horses. "Mrs. Pemberton recommended you very highly," she said, settling back into her chair while Marian stood. She had not yet been invited to sit, and she knew better than to assume. "She said you were with the Forsyth children for 3 years." "I was." "She also said you were, how did she put it, unusually self-possessed." Charlotte smiled. "I took that as a good sign. My household is rather loud at the moment. The engagement, the preparations, my brother arriving next week." She waved a hand. "It will all settle eventually. What I need is someone steady for the children. Thomas is 8 and Clara is 5, and they are—" She paused, searching for the word. "Energetic," Marian offered. Charlotte laughed. "That is one word for it." She studied Marian for a moment, not unkindly but carefully. There was something in her expression that Marian couldn't quite read, a flicker of something that came and went too quickly to name. "You'll be comfortable here, I hope, Miss Voss. We run a happy house." "I'm sure I will be, my lady." "Good," Charlotte nodded, apparently settled. "Mrs. Graves will show you to your room. Your son is welcome at meals in the kitchen, and on fine days the garden is." She stopped. The flicker again, faster this time, and then smoothed over completely. "The garden is lovely. James will like it." Marian thanked her, curtsied, and followed Mrs. Graves back out into the corridor. She did not ask about the flicker. She had learned over the years that some things were better left unasked until she had more ground beneath her feet. Her room was small and at the end of the east corridor, clean, simply furnished, with a window that looked out over the garden. James's narrow cot had already been set up beside her bed, which meant someone had prepared for a child without being told, which meant Charlotte had mentioned him in advance, which meant— Marian sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the ring of keys Mrs. Graves had pressed into her hand. It meant Charlotte had known she was coming, had wanted her specifically, had arranged for a room with 2 beds. She looked at the single expensive brooch pinned to the inside of her coat, the only thing of value she had carried out of her old life, 7 years ago in the rain, with nothing else and no one watching. The coat she'd left behind, the brooch she had kept. She unpinned it now and held it in her palm, gold, small, engraved on the back with 2 initials that were not hers. R.A. Richard Ashford, the Duke of Ashford, who was arriving next week. Marian closed her hand around the brooch and sat very still in the quiet of her small, clean room, listening to James sing something tuneless to himself on the cot beside her, and she thought about doors, about which ones she had walked through and which ones had been closed before she could reach them, and whether, after 7 years, she had any right at all to be standing in this house. She did not have an answer, but she was here, and in 1 week so would he. He arrived on a Thursday. Marian knew, because James had spent Wednesday evening pressing his nose against the drawing-room window, asking when the Duke's carriage would come, and Mrs. Graves had told him Thursday, and James had accepted this with the solemn nod of someone filing away important military intelligence. Marian had said nothing. She had instead spent Wednesday evening doing what she had been doing every evening since she arrived at Hartwell House, teaching Thomas and Clara their letters, settling James, reviewing the next day's lessons, folding her clothes, checking the brooch was still where she kept it, in the inner pocket of her winter coat, behind the extra button. Ordinary things, deliberate things, the kind of things that kept a person's hands busy when their mind wanted to go somewhere it had no business going. She did not plan to be in the entrance hall when he arrived. She was there because Clara had dropped her favorite doll down the main staircase at precisely the wrong moment, and Thomas had gone after it, and Marian had gone after Thomas, and by the time she had both children in hand and the doll retrieved, The front doors were already open, and the cold November air was coming in, and the Duke of Ashford was standing in the entrance hall of his sister's house pulling off his gloves. He was taller than she remembered. That was the first thing she thought, which was a ridiculous thing to think about a man she had known for 2 years. But time does strange things to memory, smooths certain edges, softens heights and angles, and the man standing 15 feet away from her was broader at the shoulder and harder at the jaw than the one she had carried in her mind for 7 years. He had not seen her yet. He was speaking to Charlotte, who had come down the stairs behind Marion and was now reaching up to embrace him with the easy warmth of a younger sister who has missed her brother and is not embarrassed to show it. His expression changed when he saw her. Something loosened in it briefly, before the more familiar control returned. Marion stayed very still. This was not a decision. It was simply what her body did. Clara tugged at her hand. "Miss Voss, is that the Duke?" "Yes," Marion said quietly. "He's very tall." "He is. Thomas says dukes are always cross." "Thomas should not make general statements about people he hasn't met." Thomas, who was 8 and felt this was deeply unfair, opened his mouth to argue. Marion pressed his shoulder gently, and he closed it again. The Duke turned. This was the moment she had rehearsed, in the practical, unsentimental part of her mind, for the better part of a week. She had not rehearsed it the way romantic women rehearse things, with speeches, with imagined expressions, with hoped-for outcomes. She had rehearsed it the way a person prepares for something they cannot avoid, practically, methodically, stripping it of as much feeling as possible so that when it came, there would be nothing to betray her. He looked at her. She looked back. And he did not know her. There was nothing in his face, not a flicker, not a hesitation, not even the vague discomfort of almost recognition. He looked at her the way a man of his position looks at a governess standing in his sister's entrance hall, briefly, without particular interest, and then away. "Miss Voss." Charlotte had appeared at his elbow, slightly breathless, her eyes moving between them with an expression Marion was beginning to understand was not accidental. "My brother, the Duke of Ashford. Richard, this is Miss Voss, our new governess." "Miss Voss." He said it with the same inflection he might have used for any name, polite, entirely empty. His eyes had already moved to the children. "Your Grace," Marion said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. In the quiet, private way, she had learned to be proud of things no one else would ever notice or commend. He crouched down to Charlotte's children, Thomas first, gravely, with the handshake of a man who understands that 8-year-old boys require to be taken seriously. Then Clara, who forgot all her shyness immediately and told him at length about the doll and the staircase and the full dramatic arc of the morning. He listened to all of it. He asked a question at the end. Marion watched this and did not let herself feel anything about it. Or tried not to. The trying was the part she had not fully accounted for. Dinner that evening was informal, just Charlotte and the Duke, with the children briefly before their bedtime, and Marion present in the way governesses were present at such meals, near enough to manage, invisible enough to ignore. She had mastered invisibility. What she had not mastered, what she found over the course of that hour to be considerably harder than she had anticipated, was listening to his voice. Not because of what he said. He talked about London, about the roads, about the engagement preparations and whether the weather would cooperate. Ordinary things. Charlotte laughed often. Thomas interrupted twice and was forgiven both times. It was simply his voice, the particular low register of it, the way it slowed slightly on certain words. She knew that voice in the dark. She knew it when it was not careful or composed. She knew what it sounded like when it broke. She moved Clara's cup before it could spill and looked at nothing in particular and reminded herself that she was Miss Voss, governess, And that was all she was in this room, and that was all she intended to be. After the children were in bed, she was passing the library on her way back from the kitchen when she heard Charlotte's voice through the half-open door. She seems very capable. A pause. She's a governess, Charlotte, the Duke's voice. They generally are. I only meant. I'm sure she's perfectly adequate. Another pause, longer. Richard, Charlotte's voice had changed, quieter now, with something careful in it. Don't you think she looks? I think I'd like a brandy, he said. And I think we should talk about Pemberton's guest list, which I've been told is now at 240 people, which is roughly 200 more than. Charlotte laughed, and the conversation moved, and Marian stood in the corridor outside the half-open door for only a moment longer before she walked away. Don't you think she looks? Looks what? She did not know. She told herself she did not need to know. She went to bed and lay awake for a long time in the dark, listening to James breathe in the cot beside her, and she thought about what Charlotte had been about to say, and she thought about the way the Duke had interrupted her before she could finish it. And in the morning she got up and made herself useful, because that was what she did. That was what she had always done. But 3 days later, on a bright cold morning when the frost was still on the grass and the garden was all silver and white, the Duke walked out through the side door of Hartwell House and stopped. On the stone path below the kitchen garden, a boy was crouching over something in the frost. He was 6 years old. He had dark eyes and a very serious expression, and the exact jaw of every Ashford male going back 4 generations. The Duke stood and looked at him. The boy looked up. "Good morning," the boy said with perfect composure. "I'm looking at a beetle. Would you like to see?" The Duke did not answer immediately. Something had happened to his face, not an expression exactly, more like the sudden absence of one. "What sort of beetle?" he said at last, and his voice, just for that moment, was not quite steady. "A very good one," James said firmly. "Come and look." The Duke of Ashford had, in his 34 years, negotiated land disputes with earls twice his age, sat across from cabinet ministers who wanted things from him he had no intention of giving, and buried his father at 22 without allowing his face to show the full weight of it in public. He was not, by any measure, a man who was easily unsettled. And yet he crouched down beside a 6-year-old boy on a frost-covered path and looked at a beetle he could barely see, and something in his chest did something he had no immediate word for. "He's been there since I came out," James said very seriously. "I think he's cold." "Beetles don't feel cold the way we do." James considered this. "How do you know?" The Duke paused. "I don't with any certainty." James nodded, apparently satisfied that this was an honest answer. "I think he feels it a little," he said. "He looks like he feels it a little." The Duke looked at the beetle, then he looked at the boy. He had a way of holding his shoulders straight, without stiffness, the way a child holds himself when he has been taught to take up exactly the space he is entitled to and no more. His hair was dark. His eyes, when he looked up, were very dark also and direct, and fringed with lashes that were almost absurdly long. "What's your name?" the Duke asked. "James." He did not offer a surname. The Duke noticed this. "What's yours?" "Ashford." James turned this over. "Is that your first name or your second name?" "My title." "Oh," James looked back at the beetle. "My mama says titles are what people use when they want to remind you who they are." The Duke was quiet for a moment. "Your mama sounds like an interesting woman." "She's very clever," James said simply, "and she knows everything, but she says nobody knows everything, so I don't think she really means it literally." Something moved across the Duke's face, there and gone, like a shadow crossing a wall. "Where is your mama now?" "Inside," James pointed toward the house. "She's teaching Thomas his Latin, Thomas hates Latin, I like it. I only know a little, but I like the sounds. How old are you? 6. James looked up at him again with those direct, too familiar eyes. How old are you? 34. James nodded with the expression of someone storing information for later use. Then he looked back at the beetle, apparently deciding the conversation had reached a natural resting point. The Duke did not stand up immediately. He stayed where he was, crouched on the cold path, looking at a boy who was looking at a beetle, and he had the strangest feeling, not quite a memory, more like the shape of something just out of reach. He did not mention it to Charlotte. He tried to twice over the following days, found the words forming and then dissolving before he could speak them, because what would he say? There's something about the governess's boy. What did that mean? What could it mean? Nothing, he told himself. He was tired from the journey. He was distracted by the wedding preparations and the solicitor's letters and the entirely unreasonable guest list. Children often looked like other people. It meant nothing. He was very firm about this. On the 4th day after his arrival, he came into the drawing room to find James alone, standing in front of the portrait above the fireplace. It was an old portrait, his mother and father, painted the year before Charlotte was born. His father young, stiff, proud. His mother softer, with that particular expression she had worn in the last years before she died, as though she were very slightly amused by everything around her. James had his hands clasped behind his back and his head tilted to one side, and was studying the painting with the focused intensity of someone working out a puzzle. The Duke stopped in the doorway. "That's an old one," he said. James did not startle. He simply said without turning, "I know, the lady in it looks kind." "She was." "Did you know her?" "She was my mother." James turned then. He looked at the Duke, then back at the portrait, then at the Duke again. "You look like her," he said, "around the eyes." The Duke crossed the room slowly and stood beside him, looking up at the painting he had walked past 1,000 times without truly seeing. "People used to say that," he said. "My mama has a painting," James said conversationally. "Not a big one, small. She keeps it in her coat. I've only seen it once. She didn't know I saw it." The Duke looked down at him. "What was in it?" James scrunched his nose, trying to remember. "A house, I think, and some writing on the back. I couldn't read all of it. I could only read the initials." He paused. "R and A." The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the garden. A door closed somewhere in the back of the house. The Duke said very carefully, "Are you sure?" "Yes." James looked up at him, unconcerned, already moving on. "What's for luncheon today? Cook said there might be pie, but she says that every day and sometimes it isn't pie." The Duke did not answer. He was looking at the portrait. R and A asterisk. Richard Ashford. He went to Charlotte that afternoon. She was in the morning room, surrounded by correspondence and fabric samples, and she looked up when he entered with the expression of someone who has been half expecting this moment, and is not entirely sure they are ready for it. "Richard." "How did you find her?" he said. Charlotte set down the letter she was holding. "Mrs. Pemberton recommended." "Charlotte." She was quiet. He stood in the middle of the room and looked at his sister, who was looking at her hands, and he understood, in the way that one understands things when all the pieces have been accumulating without permission, that she had known more than she had said. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Richard, it isn't." "How long?" Charlotte looked up. Her expression was not guilty, exactly. It was something more complicated than that, the face of someone who has been holding a difficult thing for a long time and is almost relieved to put it down. "Since the summer," she said. "I met her by chance at the Forsyths. She didn't tell me everything. She didn't tell me anything, really, but I knew." She paused. "I knew her face." Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't know what had happened between you, Charlotte said quietly. And I still don't. She has never said a word, Richard, not one. Whatever occurred 7 years ago, she has carried it entirely alone. She held his gaze. The boy. Don't. Richard. I said don't. His voice was controlled, very controlled, the way it got when the alternative was something he couldn't afford. I need to think. Charlotte said nothing. She watched him turn and walk to the window, where the garden was bright and cold and entirely indifferent. After a long moment he said, without turning around, his jaw. Yes, Charlotte said softly. He has my jaw. Yes. Another silence, longer. She never told me, he said, and his voice just then was not controlled at all. That evening, Marion was coming down the back stairs with a candle. James had woken from a bad dream, and she had gone to the kitchen for warm milk, when she nearly walked directly into the Duke in the lower corridor. They both stopped. The corridor was narrow. The candle between them threw unsteady light across both their faces. He was still dressed, which meant he had not slept either. She waited for him to speak. He looked at her for a long moment, really looked at her, the way he had not in the entrance hall, the way she had told herself not to want. And she saw the exact moment that the last 7 years rearranged themselves behind his eyes. Marion, he said. Not Miss Voss. Marion. The first time he had said her name in 7 years, and he said it the same way he always had, like it was something he was careful with. She held the candle steady. James needs his milk, she said. If you'll excuse me, Your Grace. She walked past him. Her hands did not shake until she reached the kitchen, and by then she was alone, and no one saw. She had known this moment would come. Not this exact moment, not the corridor, not the candle, not his voice saying her name in the dark like something he had been keeping in his mouth for years, but the reckoning. The point at which 7 years of careful distance collapsed into a space too small to navigate around each other. She had known. She had come anyway. That was the part she had not fully explained to herself. The next morning she was brisk and practical and entirely Miss Voss. She got James dressed. She got Thomas through his Latin without tears, which was an achievement. She sat with Clara through a drawing lesson and praised a horse that looked considerably more like a potato and said nothing about the difference. The Duke was not at breakfast. Charlotte was, and she watched Marion with an expression of careful neutrality that cost her visible effort. Marion did not acknowledge it. She poured James his milk, reminded Thomas to sit straight, and cut Clara's bread into the small triangles she preferred, and she was so thoroughly and deliberately ordinary that she almost convinced herself. Almost. It was Mrs. Graves, who came to find her that afternoon. James was in the garden with Thomas and Clara, visible from the window, loudly supervising what appeared to be some sort of military operation involving sticks. Marion was at the schoolroom table, preparing the next week's lessons, when the housekeeper appeared in the doorway with an expression she had not worn before. His Grace would like a word, Mrs. Graves said, in the library. Marion set down her pen. Now, if it's convenient. The way she said it made clear that convenience was not strictly the point. Marion looked out the window at James, who was currently directing Thomas to hold a stick at a specific angle with the focused authority of a very small general. Of course, she said and followed. The library at Hartwell House was a long room with high ceilings and windows that faced the west garden. In the afternoon light it was all gold and shadow, the shelves dark, the desk by the window bright. The Duke was standing when she entered, not at the desk but beside it, and he had something in his hand. A bundle of letters, tied with a ribbon that had once been blue and had faded to the color of old smoke. Marion stopped just inside the door. She looked at the letters. Something happened in her chest, a dropping sensation, like a step she had not expected. "Close the door, please," he said. She closed it. He did not ask her to sit. She did not sit. They stood on opposite sides of the room with the afternoon light between them, and he looked at her the way he had in the corridor, like a man revising something he thought he knew, and then he held up the letters. "I found these yesterday," he said, "in the cabinet in the East Corridor. Charlotte uses it for old correspondence." He paused. "These are not Charlotte's." Marian said nothing. "They're addressed to you," he said. "Your name, your mother's address in Bath, written over the course of approximately 4 months." Another pause. 7 years ago. The room was very quiet. "They were never sent," he said. Marian looked at the letters in his hand and felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Not grief. Exactly. Something older than grief. The particular pain of a wound you have learned to live around discovering it was never necessary. "Who wrote them?" she asked, though she thought she already knew. He set them on the desk and took one step back, not away, just back, giving her space she hadn't asked for. "I did," he said. She crossed the room slowly. She picked up the bundle and looked at the top letter. Her name in his handwriting, which she would have known anywhere. The address in Bath. The date, March, 7 years ago, 2 months after she had left London, 1 month after she had discovered she was carrying James. She had written to him. 3 letters carefully over those first terrible months. She had not begged. She had not accused. She had simply told him the truth, that she was gone, that she was well, that there was something he needed to know, and she had received nothing in return. Nothing. And she had understood, the way a person understands something they have been dreading, that his silence was its own answer, that whatever they had been to each other, whatever he had said, he had made his choice. She had made hers. She had built a life around it. "I don't understand," she said. Her voice was very even. "I wrote to you." "I know. I wrote 3 times." "I know." He moved then, coming to stand beside the desk, close enough that she could see the tension in his jaw. "I received none of them, Marian. I received nothing from you. I thought—" He stopped, pressed his mouth together, started again. "I thought you had gone. I thought you had chosen to go. I thought—" "You thought I left?" "Yes. I thought you stopped writing." He looked at her. "I never stopped." The room held this for a moment. Outside the window, somewhere in the garden, James shouted something triumphant. Both of them heard it. Neither of them moved. "Then someone took the letters," Marian said. "Yes." "Someone intercepted mine as well." "Yes." She set the bundle back down on the desk very carefully, as though it were something that might break, and she stepped back and looked at the man across from her and thought about 7 years. About Bath, and the small rooms, and the morning she had understood she was alone in a way she had not been before. About James, born in February, with dark eyes and a jaw that was not hers. About every choice she had made since then, each one shaped around an absence she had believed was chosen. "Who?" she said. He was quiet for just a moment too long. She looked at him sharply. "Richard, who took the letters?" "I don't know with certainty," he said. "Not yet, but I have a very strong suspicion." "Tell me." "Marian." "Tell me." He met her eyes, and what she saw in his face was not evasion. It was something more careful than that. Deliberate. Like a man who has thought about the order in which to say things and is trying to get it right. "Do you remember my solicitor?" he said. "Hargrove." She thought, a thin man, gray at the temples, always present at the edges of things. Vaguely. "He managed all of my correspondence while I was in the country that winter. Everything in, everything out." He paused. "He also managed my father's estate and my mother's will." Marian waited. "My mother left a bequest," the Duke said, "conditional, to be distributed upon my marriage to my wife directly. A significant sum, property in Wiltshire, and an income attached to it. He looked at her carefully. She left instructions that it was not to pass through my solicitor's hands, that it was to go directly. Hargrove knew this. He also knew that if I married, particularly if I married someone my mother had chosen, his management of the estate finances would be considerably reduced. The silence stretched. He had a financial interest, Marion said slowly, in you not marrying. In me not marrying the right person, the Duke said, specifically. And your mother, she stopped. Something was assembling itself in her mind, slowly, piece by piece. Your mother knew about me. She met you once, at the Harrington ball, do you remember? She did. A small woman, sharp-eyed, who had held her hand a moment longer than strictly necessary and said, with a smile that contained considerable more than politeness, "You have a sensible face, my dear. I find I prefer sensible faces." She approved of me, Marion said. It was not a question. She told me so directly 3 days later, he said, which I expect Hargrove knew. He was thorough about knowing things. Marion looked at the letters on the desk. 7 years. A boy who was 6 years old. Muddy boots in servants' corridors, and the particular loneliness of being entirely self-sufficient because there was no alternative. All of it because a thin man with gray temples had decided that his income mattered more than the truth. She felt something move through her, not the hot, immediate rage she might have expected, but something slower and colder and considerably more dangerous. "Where is he now?" she said. "Still my solicitor." He said it with a flatness that told her he had been sitting with his own version of this fury since yesterday. "Until Monday, when I intend to correct that." And the proof. The letters themselves, the dates, his handwriting on the outer wrapping, I recognized it when I looked closely. And there is a woman in my London household, a senior maid who has been with the family 15 years, who I believe saw more than she has ever been asked to account for. He paused. "I will ask." Marion nodded slowly. The afternoon light had shifted while they talked. The room was cooler now, the gold gone out of it. "You should have told me last night," she said, "in the corridor." "Last night I had only the letters and a suspicion," he said. "I needed to be certain before I said anything to you. You deserved certainty." She looked at him. He looked back. And for the first time since she had walked through the servants' entrance of Hartwell House with her wet coat and her careful face, she felt the thing she had been holding at arm's length for 7 years press forward without permission. "I need to check on James," she said. "Marion." "I need," she stopped, pressed her hand flat against the desk for just a moment, steadied herself. "I need a little time." He said nothing, but he stepped aside and she walked to the door, and she had her hand on the handle when his voice came from behind her, quiet, stripped of all its careful control. "I looked for you," he said. "When you stopped writing, I looked. I didn't find you, and eventually he stopped. I should have looked longer." She stood at the door. She did not turn around. "Yes," she said, "you should have." And she walked out. That night she lay awake and thought about Hargrove. About a thin man with gray temples, who had held 2 lives apart with nothing more than intercepted envelopes and careful silence. About James, asleep in the cot beside her, who had his father's jaw and had asked a beetle whether it was cold, and had told the Duke of Ashford, with complete confidence, that his mama knew everything. About the letters on the desk, all those careful words, 7 years old, that had never arrived. About the 3 she had sent, that had never arrived either. About what might have been different. She did not let herself stay long in that place, the place of what might have been. She had learned, out of pure necessity, to live in what was. What was had given her James. What was had made her someone who could walk into a house through the servant's entrance and still know precisely who she was. She would not trade that. But she lay awake for a long time. And in the morning, something had shifted, not resolved, not decided but shifted, like weather changing, like a door that has been closed for so long you've stopped noticing it, suddenly standing slightly ajar. She got up. She got James dressed. She went downstairs. And at the bottom of the stairs, on the hall table, someone had left a single hothouse rose in a small glass, cream-colored, just opened with no card. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she went to make herself useful. But she was smiling very slightly when she thought no one could see. Mrs. Graves, coming out of the kitchen corridor, saw. She said nothing, but she smiled too, briefly into the middle distance, and went about her morning. The engagement dinner was Charlotte's idea, naturally. It was to be a small affair by the standards of the county. Only 40 guests, which Charlotte said with the breezy confidence of someone who had never personally arranged seating for 40 people, in a house that comfortably held 30 at table. There would be the Pembrokes from the North Estate, the Harrington cousins down from Edinburgh, 3 of Charlotte's school friends with their husbands, and various neighboring families who had known the Ashfords long enough to feel entitled to a place at any celebration bearing the name. Marian heard all of this from Mrs. Graves, who delivered information the way experienced housekeepers delivered most things, as established fact, without editorial comment, though with a precision that implied she had strong opinions she was choosing not to voice. "The children will come down for the first hour," Mrs. Graves said, on the morning of the dinner, standing in the schoolroom doorway while Marian organized the day's books. "Lady Ashford wants them seen. After that, you'll take them up." "Of course. You'll stay for dinner." Marian looked up. "Lady Ashford's instruction," Mrs. Graves said, in a tone that suggested this had already been discussed and settled and was not a matter for further debate. "She wants James included." She was quite specific. There was something in the way she said it, not warm, exactly, but not neutral either, that made Marian set down the book she was holding and look at the housekeeper properly. "Mrs. Graves," she said carefully, "how much do you know?" The housekeeper was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the careful precision of someone who has decided exactly how much to give, "I have been in service to the Ashford family for 22 years. I knew his mother. I know his Grace rather well, I think, though he would probably not say so." She paused. "I also know that there are very few coincidences in this world, Miss Voss, and a governess arriving at Hartwell House 3 weeks before the Duke with a 6-year-old boy who holds his shoulders in a very particular way is not one of them." Marian said nothing. "I don't require confirmation," Mrs. Graves said. "I simply want you to know that whatever happens this evening, you will not be without allies in this house." She looked at Marian steadily. "Lady Ashford has placed you at the main table, not the staff end. The main table, 4 seats from the top. She'll cause talk. She is aware of that. The Duke is also aware." Mrs. Graves smoothed her apron in the manner of someone closing a subject. "James will sit beside you. Thomas and Clara will be at the far end with their nursemaid for the first course, then taken up." She turned to go, then paused. "Wear the blue dress, Miss Voss. The gray one is perfectly adequate for a governess, but you are not, I think, only a governess." She left before Marian could respond. Marian stood in the middle of the schoolroom for a long moment, looking at nothing in particular. Then she went to find the blue dress. She had not worn it since Bath. It was not a grand dress. She had no grand dresses, had sold the last of them in the first year, when money was the kind of problem that required immediate practical solutions. But it was well made, a deep, quiet blue that was not quite fashionable and not quite plain, with a simplicity that good fabric could carry. She had kept it because it had been a gift, not from him, from his mother, pressed into her hands at the Harrington ball with the same shrewd smile and the words, "Blue suits women who know their own minds, I find." She had not let herself think about why she had kept it. She thought about it now, doing up the buttons, looking at herself in the small mirror above the washstand. James appeared in the doorway behind her, already dressed in his good jacket, his hair brushed into reluctant tidiness. He looked at her in the mirror. "You look different," he said. "Different how?" He considered this with the seriousness he applied to most questions. "Like yourself," he said finally, but louder. Marian looked at her reflection. "That's a very strange thing to say." "I know," James agreed, entirely untroubled by this. "Can I have a biscuit before dinner?" "No." "What if I'm very hungry?" "Then dinner will be all the more satisfying." She turned from the mirror and held out her hand. "Come on, let's go down." The guests arrived in the early evening, carriages coming up the drive in the thin winter dark, and Hartwell House filled with the particular noise of 40 people who all knew each other well enough to have opinions about each other. Marian kept the children near the edges of the drawing room, where they could be seen by Charlotte, and steered away from anyone who might ask complicated questions. She was aware of the Duke across the room from the moment she entered it. Not because she looked for him, because her body, apparently, had retained certain information regardless of what her mind had decided about it. He was speaking with two men she didn't know near the fireplace, and he was wearing the kind of carefully composed expression that she now recognized as his public face, present, attentive, slightly formal, giving away nothing. He did not look at her when she entered. But Charlotte did. Charlotte looked at her and then at James, and something moved across her face that was complicated and relieved and slightly apprehensive all at once. And she smiled, and Marian smiled back, and that was all that passed between them. Thomas found a boy his own age among the guests, and disappeared into a corner with the speed of someone who has been making polite conversation for a full 10 minutes, and has reached his absolute limit. Clara attached herself to Charlotte's skirt and stayed there, peering out at the room with enormous eyes. James stood beside Marian and surveyed the assembled company with the calm, assessing air of someone who has not yet decided what he thinks but is gathering data. "There are a lot of people," he said. "There are. Do you know them?" "Some of them a long time ago." James looked up at her. "From before." She had not told him much about before. Enough, she believed in enough, in age-appropriate honesty, in not building a childhood on a foundation of gaps, but not everything. He knew his father existed. He knew there had been a misunderstanding. He knew that misunderstanding sometimes took a long time to untangle, like the knots he made in his bootlaces on cold mornings when his fingers didn't work properly. "Yes," she said, "from before." He nodded, processing this, and returned to his survey of the room. Then very quietly, without looking at her, "Is he here, my father?" Marian's chest did something careful and complicated. "Yes," she said. "Which one?" She did not answer immediately. Across the room, as though he had felt the weight of the question from 30 feet away, the Duke turned. Not a scan of the room, a specific turn, directly to where she was standing. Their eyes met. He held it for just a moment, and in that moment his public face slipped, just slightly, the composure giving way to something that had no public name. Then someone spoke to him, and he turned back. "The tall one," Marian said, "by the fireplace." James looked. He was quiet for a long time, longer than she expected. Longer than 6-year-olds usually managed silence. She could feel him thinking beside her, the particular quality of his stillness when something had caught in his mind and was turning over. "He looks like his portrait," James said finally. Marian looked at him. "The one in the drawing room," James said. "The old one, he looks like the man in it." He paused. "And he looks like me, a bit." Another pause, shorter, around the jaw. Marian said nothing. "I noticed before," James said, entirely conversationally, as though this were a mildly interesting observation about the weather. "I didn't say because I wasn't sure if I was supposed to notice." You can always notice things, Marian said, very carefully. You just don't always have to say them out loud. I know, he looked up at her. Are you all right, Mama? Yes, she said. You're doing your careful face. Am I? You always do it when something is important. He slipped his hand into hers, small, warm, entirely matter-of-fact about it. It's all right. I'm not scared. She looked down at him. This boy, she thought. This extraordinary, infuriating, entirely unearned gift of a boy. Neither am I, she said. And for the first time in a very long time, she meant it. Dinner was announced at 8. Charlotte had arranged the table with the precision of a woman who had thought very carefully about exactly what she was doing, and had done it anyway with considerable nerve. Marian was seated 4 places from the head, as Mrs. Graves had said, between a pleasant older woman named Lady Forsyth and an empty chair to her left that turned out to belong to a colonel who arrived late and talked exclusively about his horse for the duration of the first course, which Marian found unexpectedly restful. James sat beside her, straight-backed, handling his cutlery with the focused concentration of a child who has been drilled on this and is determined not to disgrace himself. He ate his soup without incident. He answered Lady Forsyth's questions about his age and his lessons with perfect politeness. He did not mention beetles. Marian was almost beginning to think the evening might simply pass, without incident, without the thing she had been half bracing for since she came downstairs. And then the first course was cleared and the second brought in, and the conversation around the table loosened and expanded the way dinner conversation does when wine has been poured twice. And across the table, a woman named Mrs. Alderton, wife of one of the Duke's neighbors, sharp-featured, the kind of person who asks questions that are not really questions, leaned forward and said, with a smile like a letter opener, "And whose little boy is this? He's a handsome thing." The table did not quite go quiet, but something shifted in it. "My son," Marian said, "James." "How lovely." Mrs. Alderton's eyes moved over Marian with a swift, practiced assessment. "And Mr. Voss, is he joining us this evening?" "There is no Mr. Voss," Marian said pleasantly. A small silence. "I see," said Mrs. Alderton, in a tone that said she saw considerably more than was polite to acknowledge. James, who had been eating his fish with focused attention, looked up. He looked at Mrs. Alderton. He looked at Marian. He looked at Mrs. Alderton again. And then, with the terrible, devastating clarity that children produce when they have been listening more carefully than anyone realized, he said, "I have a father, I just haven't spoken to him yet, but I'm going to." The silence this time was absolute. Marian felt every pair of eyes at the table perform a swift, involuntary calculation, moving from James to the room at large, searching for variables, arriving at conclusions with the speed that 40 people of good society can move when presented with sufficient material. She did not look at the Duke. She did not need to. She could feel him at the head of the table as clearly as if he had spoken. Mrs. Alderton had the expression of a woman who has accidentally ignited something and is unsure whether to be appalled or delighted. Charlotte, 3 seats away, had gone completely, carefully still, the stillness of someone who is neither surprised nor certain what happens next. And then James, apparently satisfied that he had made his position clear, returned to his fish. "This is very good," he said to no one in particular. "I like fish when it doesn't have bones." It was the Duke who spoke. Not immediately. There were several seconds in which the table held its collective breath, and the candlelight flickered and Marian looked at her plate and thought, with the distant, almost calm clarity of someone in the middle of something unavoidable, "Here it is, then." And then his voice from the head of the table, quiet and entirely composed. "James." The boy looked up. Across the length of the table, across the candlesticks and the crystal and the faces of 40 people who were all pretending not to watch. The Duke of Ashford looked at his son for the first time with full and complete knowledge of what he was looking at. "What is your favorite subject?" he asked. James considered this seriously. "Latin," he said, "and beetles." "Beetles," the Duke repeated. "I know a great deal about beetles," James said. "I could tell you if you like, after dinner." "A beet. I would like that very much," the Duke said. And something in his voice, not quite steady, not quite even, just slightly rougher than it had been a moment before, moved through the table like a current, and Marian felt it reach her and pass through her, and she pressed her hand flat against her thigh beneath the tablecloth and breathed. Lady Forsyth, beside her, leaned in very slightly and said, under the noise of the table resuming itself, "What a remarkable boy." "Yes," Marian said. "He has his mother's composure." Marian almost laughed. She pressed her lips together instead. "He has," she agreed. The children were taken up after the second course. Marian rose to go with them. It was her place, her role, the thing she was here to do, and she had James's hand and was turning from the table when the Duke's voice came again, quiet enough that only those nearest could hear. "Miss Voss." She stopped. "Stay," he said, simply, one word. She felt the table hold its breath again. She looked at Charlotte, who gave the smallest possible nod, barely a movement, more an intention. She looked at James, who was already going cheerfully with the nursemaid, entirely untroubled, turning at the door to give the room a general wave that no one had asked for and everyone received. She sat back down. She picked up her glass. Her hand was perfectly steady. Across the table, Mrs. Alderton was looking at her with an expression that had moved all the way from sharp curiosity to something that was almost, reluctantly, respect. Marian looked back at her calmly. Then she turned to Lady Forsyth and asked about her garden, and the conversation moved, and the candles burned, and at the head of the table the Duke of Ashford sat with the expression of a man who has just made a decision so large he can feel the weight of it rearranging everything beneath him. He did not look away from her for the rest of the evening. She noticed. She let herself notice. After dinner, when the guests had moved to the drawing room and the noise had risen, and the evening had loosened into the informal ease of people who have eaten well and drunk sufficiently, Marian found herself near the door to the hallway, not leaving, simply standing at the edge of things the way she had learned to stand at the edge of things, when the Duke appeared beside her. Not suddenly. He crossed the room at the pace of a man with somewhere specific to be, speaking to two people briefly on his way, and then he was there, and the party was around them and also, somehow, elsewhere entirely. "He meant it," the Duke said, "about the beetles." "He always means everything," Marian said. "He's not a child who says things he doesn't mean." A pause, not uncomfortable, the kind of pause that has weight in it. "He's extraordinary," the Duke said quietly. Marian looked at the room, at Charlotte bright and happy, surrounded by people who loved her, at the fire, the candles, the warmth of a house that was full. "Yes," she said, "he is." "Marian." He said her name the same way he had said it in the corridor, carefully, like something he was handling with both hands. "I want to," he stopped, tried again. "There is a great deal I want to say to you, that I should have said, that I would have said 7 years ago if I had." "I know," she said. "I'm not certain you do, not all of it." She turned to look at him then. Really look, the way she had not allowed herself since the entrance hall. The lines that hadn't been there before, the gray at his temple just beginning, the same eyes exactly the same that James had looked at in a portrait and said, "You look like her, around the eyes." "Then tell me," she said. "Not now, not here, but tell me." He held her gaze. "Tomorrow," he said, "will you walk with me?" She thought about 7 years, about letters that never arrived, About a boy who had his father's jaw and held his shoulders straight and told beetles they might be cold. Yes, she said. Just that, just yes. But the way she said it, and the way he heard it, contained considerably more than one word. The morning was cold and very clear. The kind of winter morning that arrives occasionally in November as though by mistake, the sky a pale, washed blue, the frost on the grass catching the early light and throwing it back in small, sharp pieces, the air so still that sound carried further than it should. Marian could hear the horses in the distant stable from the garden path. She could hear a woodpecker somewhere in the elms beyond the wall. She could hear her own breathing, which she was monitoring with more attention than she would have liked to admit. She had told James she was going for a walk. James had looked at her with his particular expression, the one that meant he had already formed a view and was deciding whether to share it, and then said, "With him." "Yes." "Good," James said, and went back to his breakfast with the air of someone whose work was done. Marian had stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a moment, looking at her son, and had felt something she didn't have a word for. Not quite amusement, not quite grief. Something that lived between the two, the particular feeling of watching a child be wiser than you in a way you cannot entirely account for and cannot take credit for, and are grateful for in a way that goes all the way down. Then she had put on her coat, the winter one, the good one, with the brooch in the inner pocket, and come downstairs. He was already in the garden. He was standing at the far end of the stone path, looking out over the frost-covered lawn toward the elms, and he turned when he heard her footsteps on the gravel. He was dressed simply for a duke, a dark coat, no hat, which struck her as slightly careless, and for some reason made her chest do something inconvenient. He looked like a man who had been outside for a while already, like a man who had not slept particularly well and had come out here to do something with the restlessness. She understood that. She had not slept particularly well either. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning." They fell into step beside each other naturally, the way people do when they have walked together before and the body remembers even when the mind is being careful. Down the stone path, through the gate in the garden wall, out onto the longer walk that ran along the edge of the estate toward the river. For a while neither of them spoke. This was not uncomfortable. That was the thing she noticed first, that after everything, after 7 years and a dinner table full of witnesses and a child who had announced his intentions to a room full of strangers, the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of people who are gathering themselves, who are deciding where to begin when there is so much that the beginning is hard to locate. The frost crunched beneath their feet. The pale blue sky held. Somewhere above them a hawk moved in a long, slow circle and was gone. The Duke spoke first. "I want to tell you about the year after you left," he said. Not an opening, exactly, more like a door he had decided to walk through directly rather than stand outside any longer. "I want you to know what it was. I'm not asking for anything from it. I just think you should know." Marian looked ahead at the path. "All right," she said. He was quiet for a moment, organizing something. "At first I thought you had simply gone," he said. "That you had decided that whatever we had been you had waited and found it insufficient and gone. I thought that was your right. I told myself that was your right." A pause. "I was not, I think, entirely convincing even to myself." "No." "No," something dry and rueful in his voice. "I wrote the first letter almost immediately, within the week. I told myself it was simply to make sure you were well, that that everything had been settled cleanly between us." He paused again. "That was not entirely why I wrote." "I know." He glanced at her. "I wrote 11 letters over 4 months, each one a little less restrained than the last. Hargrove posted them, or so I believed. I received nothing back." He looked ahead again. "And eventually I did what people do, I suppose. I told myself a story about it that I could live inside, that you were well, that you had moved on, That it was better this way, cleaner, that I had nothing to offer you that was worth the complications. What complications? He was quiet for a moment. My father had arranged a match, he said, before he died. A formal arrangement contracted with a family in Shropshire. I had not agreed to it, not properly, but it existed, and Hargrove knew it existed, and I suspect he made very sure that you knew it existed also. Marian stopped walking. He stopped too, turned to look at her. She looked back at him and felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the November air. He told me, she said slowly, in the spring, a letter. I thought it was from your household official correspondence telling me that you were engaged, that the arrangements had been made. She paused. I thought it was from you. The Duke's jaw tightened. It was not from me. I know that now. I was never engaged to that woman. I ended the arrangement within the year. I told Hargrove to communicate that the matter was closed. He looked at her steadily. He apparently communicated a great many things that were not true and failed to communicate a great many things that were. Marian turned and started walking again. Not away, just forward. She needed to move. He fell into step beside her. So, she said, working through it. He took your letters. He took mine. He sent a false letter telling me you were engaged. He managed all correspondence, which means he also knew at some point that I was, she stopped. That you were expecting a child. He said it quietly without flinching. Yes. I don't know when he knew. I suspect he knew before I did, because he managed communication with your mother's household for a period, and his voice tightened. I suspect he knew for some time. Marian thought about this. About a thin man with gray temples sitting in a comfortable London office, reading letters that were not addressed to him, making decisions about other people's lives with the calm practicality of someone managing an estate problem, moving people around like figures on a ledger. A woman here, a child there, a duke, kept in the dark, grieving something he couldn't name, gradually building a life around an absence. He had so much power, she said, and her voice came out quieter than she expected, with something in it that was not quite rage and not quite sorrow, and was perhaps the feeling of understanding fully, for the first time, exactly how small she had been made without ever being told she was being made small. He did, the Duke said. He had the power that people acquire when others trust them entirely and don't look closely. My father trusted him. I inherited that trust. I didn't question it because there was never a reason given to me to question it. He paused. That is not an excuse. I should have looked more closely, at a great many things. They walked in silence for a moment. Did your mother know, Marian asked, what he was? I don't think she knew specifically, but I think she suspected his loyalties were complicated. It's why she structured the bequest the way she did, bypassing him. He paused. She was a very intelligent woman. She saw things in people clearly. She saw something in me. She told me, he said, that you were the most sensible woman she had met in 20 years of London seasons, and that I would be a fool to let you go. Marian looked at the path ahead. She was right, she said. Yes, he said, she was. They had reached the river. It was not much of a river, a narrow thing, more a wide stream, running between banks of dead reed and frost-pale grass. There was a wooden bench on the near bank, old and slightly weathered, the kind of bench that has been there long enough to feel like it belongs to the landscape rather than having been placed in it. They sat down on it without discussing whether to sit, simply because they had reached the end of the path and the bench was there and there was more to say. The water moved quietly between the reeds. A heron stood on the far bank, motionless, gray as old stone. I want to ask you something, the Duke said, and I want you to know that whatever the answer is, I will accept it. I am not asking in order to pressure you toward a particular response. I am asking because you deserve to be asked directly rather than maneuvered into things, and I think you have been maneuvered into enough things in your life, and I would very much prefer not to be the next person to do that to you." Marian looked at the Heron. "Ask," she said. He turned slightly on the bench to look at her properly. "What do you want?" he said. "Not what is practical, not what makes sense given the circumstances, not what would be best for James or for the family or for anyone's reputation. What do you want?" She was quiet for a long moment. The Heron moved one slow, deliberate step along the bank, and then went still again. "I want James to know his father," she said. "That is not negotiable, and it has nothing to do with you and me. I want that regardless of anything else." "Done," he said immediately. She stopped, started again. "I want not to come through the back door." He looked at her. "I want not to be Miss Voss when I am in a room where I am something else," she said. "I have been Miss Voss for 7 years because it was necessary, and I am not ashamed of it. I am not ashamed of anything I have done to build a life for my son. But I am tired of making myself smaller than I am in order to fit inside spaces that were not built for me." "You will never have to do that again," he said. And the way he said it, not a promise, something more fundamental than a promise, a statement of fact that he was prepared to make true through whatever means necessary, made her look at him directly for the first time since they had sat down. "And us," she said, "what do you want?" He held her gaze. "You," he said, "that is the complete answer. It has been the complete answer for 9 years, I think, though I was not always sufficiently intelligent to know what to do with it." A pause. "I want you to have the time you need. I want to earn what was taken from us rather than simply claiming it back as though the 7 years didn't happen. They happened. They cost you more than they cost me, and I know that." He paused again. "But I want very much to begin." The river moved. The Heron stood. The frost on the grass was beginning to ease in the morning sun, small drops forming at the tips of blades, the white retreating. "You interrupted Charlotte," Marian said. "The first evening. She was going to say something about me and you stopped her." He blinked, surprised, she thought, that she had heard that, or perhaps that she had remembered it. "I stopped her because I didn't know yet what was true," he said. "And I thought if there was any chance, any possibility, I didn't want you to be defined for me by someone else's words again. I wanted to," he stopped. "I wanted to find out for myself. I wanted to look at you and see you, not a story someone else told me about you." Marian was quiet for a moment. She reached into the inner pocket of her coat. She took out the brooch. She held it in her palm, between them in the winter sunlight, small and gold, the initials on the back catching the light. R.A. "I kept it," she said. "I'm not entirely sure why. For the first few years I told myself it was because it was valuable and I might need to sell it, but I never sold it." She looked at it. "And then I stopped explaining it to myself." He looked at the brooch. Something moved across his face, recognition, and something older than recognition. "My mother gave that to me," he said quietly. "When I was 20, she said keep it for someone worth the keeping." He looked up at her. "I gave it to you 6 months after we met. Do you remember what you said?" "I said I couldn't take it." "And I said—" "You said I already had." She closed her hand around the brooch. "You were very pleased with yourself about that." "I was," he said. And there it was, the thing she had seen in the corridor, in the library, at the dinner table, the thing that had been struggling through 7 years of careful control, a smile, real and unguarded, the one she had known before any of this, the one that had nothing public in it at all. She felt it land somewhere in her chest and stay there. "Richard," she said. "Yes. I'm not ready to say everything is resolved. There is still Hargrove. There is still the question of what we tell James, and how, and when. There are things that will need to be handled carefully, and I will not be rushed through them for the sake of. I know. I mean it. I will not be swept into anything. I have been making my own decisions for 7 years, and I intend to keep making them." "I know," he said again. "I am not asking you to stop. I would not know what to do with a woman who had stopped making her own decisions. It would be entirely unfamiliar. She looked at him. "You're doing it again," she said. "What?" "Being pleased with yourself." Am I? But he was smiling, and she was smiling, and the river moved between the reeds, and somewhere behind them in the house, a 6-year-old boy with his father's jaw was almost certainly telling Mrs. Graves everything he knew about beetles. "Will you let me try again?" he said quietly, without performance. Just the question offered plainly, held out like the brooch, small, gold, engraved with something that had always been hers. She looked at the river. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. One word. The same word she had given him the night before, in a room full of people, when he had asked her to walk with him. But this one was different. This one had the full weight of 7 years behind it, and the full knowledge of what had been lost and what had been kept, and what, against all reasonable expectation, might yet be recovered. He did not reach for her hand. He simply sat beside her on the old bench by the river, and the sun moved a little higher and the frost continued its slow retreat, and after a while she turned her collar up against the cold and he did not comment on it but shifted, just slightly, so that his shoulder was beside hers, and the warmth between them was considerable for two people who had not yet touched. They sat there for a long time. It was enough. For now, it was entirely enough. The confrontation with Hargrove happened on Monday. Marian was not present for it. She had not asked to be, and the Duke had not suggested it. He had simply told her on Sunday evening that he was writing to Hargrove that night, and that the man would be at Hartwell House by noon the next day, and that by the end of it the matter would be resolved. She had asked how. He had said completely. She had looked at his face, not the public face, not the composed one, but the one underneath it, the one that had been there on the riverbank, and she had believed him. She spent Monday morning teaching Latin and drawing, and a long digression on the migratory habits of birds prompted by James seeing something out the schoolroom window, and refusing to let it go until it had been fully investigated. She drank her tea, and she looked out at the garden, and she waited with the particular patience of a woman who has spent 7 years being patient and has become, if not peaceful about it, at least practiced. At 1:30, Charlotte came to find her. She came alone, without Mrs. Graves, without ceremony, and she sat down in the chair beside Marian's, and she took both of her hands in the way of a woman who has been wanting to do this for some time, and has finally run out of reasons not to. "It's done," she said. "Richard has the written confession." Hargrove saw very quickly that the alternative was considerably worse. The letters, the false correspondence, all of it. He's been dismissed. The solicitor in London has been notified. It will be handled. Marian looked at her hands in Charlotte's. "All right," she said. He also, Charlotte paused, something shifting in her expression, admitted to something else. "Something I didn't know." She paused again. "My father knew not everything, but enough. He knew Hargrove had managed the situation. He chose not to look closely." Her voice was even but effortful. "He chose his solicitor's convenience over his son's, over what was right." Marian was quiet. "I'm sorry," Charlotte said. "I don't know if that changes anything for you, but I thought you should know." "It doesn't change what matters," Marian said. "It explains some things, but it doesn't change them." Charlotte nodded. Then quietly, "I should have told Richard the moment I recognized you at the Forsyths. I found reasons not to. I told myself I didn't know enough, that it wasn't my place, that you should be the one to decide. But the truth is I was frightened of getting it wrong. I am sorry for that also." Marian looked at this woman, 24 years old, 3 weeks from her own wedding, who had found her by chance or by instinct or by something else entirely, and had brought her here, and had put her at the main table and told Mrs. Graves to suggest the blue dress, and left a rose in a glass in the hallway with no card. "You got it right in the end," Marian said. Charlotte's eyes were bright. "Did I?" she said. "You brought me here," Marian said simply. "That was enough." Charlotte squeezed her hands. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. That afternoon, James met his father. Properly. Not across a dinner table, not in a corridor, not on a frost-covered path where a 6-year-old had cropped up unexpectedly beside a beetle. In the library, just the three of them, the door closed, the fire going, the afternoon light coming through the west windows in long, pale strips. Marian had prepared for this conversation carefully. She had thought about what to say and how much and in what order, the way she prepared everything, practically, with full attention to the person on the receiving end. In the event, James made it considerably easier than she had anticipated. He walked into the library, looked at the Duke sitting in the chair by the fire, and said, without preamble, "You're my father." The Duke looked at him. "Yes," he said, "I am." James nodded. Then he said, "Why didn't you come before?" A silence. The Duke looked at Marian briefly. She gave him nothing, not permission, not direction. This was his to answer. He looked back at James. "There was a misunderstanding," he said. "A very large and very unfair one. I didn't know you existed, and your mother didn't know that I didn't know." He paused. "We were kept apart by someone who should not have done what he did, and I am very sorry that it means you have spent 6 years without me. That was not something either of us chose." James processed this. "Like the knots in my bootlaces," he said. The Duke blinked. Yes, exactly like that. Mama always says misunderstandings are like knots. They look worse than they are if you don't pull the wrong end." "Your mama," the Duke said carefully, "is almost certainly the wisest person in this house." James considered whether to agree with this and apparently decided it was accurate. "Are you going to be around now?" he asked. "Yes. All the time. As much as you'll have me." James thought about this with the gravity it deserved. "All right," he said. "Can I show you my beetle collection? I've been pressing them. Mrs. Graves gave me the paper." The Duke's expression did something complicated and private and very human. "I would like nothing better," he said. Marian stood by the window and watched her son lead the Duke of Ashford to the table where a 6-year-old's beetle collection was laid out with the precision of a natural historian. And she thought about all the mornings she had gotten up and made herself useful, and all the evenings she had lain awake listening to James breathe, and the brooch in the pocket of her coat, and the letters that had never arrived, and the rose in the glass with no card, and the river in the morning with the frost retreating. She thought about doors. Which ones had been closed and which ones had opened, and which ones, she was beginning to understand, had never been locked at all, had only needed someone to push. She had pushed. She was still here. And across the room, a man who had his son's jaw, or a boy who had his father's, was bending over a pressed beetle with an expression of complete and genuine attention, and James was explaining something at length, and the fire was warm, and the afternoon light was kind. Good asterisk, she thought, simply that. Good. 1 year later, the morning light came through the east windows of Ashford House differently than it did anywhere else. Marian had noticed this in the first weeks, the way it arrived early and spread slowly, moving across the floors in long pale rectangles that shifted through the morning like something alive. In Bath, the light had come in narrow and gray, through windows that faced a courtyard. In Hartwell House, it had been softer, more diffuse, filtered through old ivy. Here it was direct and unhurried and entirely sure of itself, and she had come in the months since to find it something close to a daily reassurance. She was sitting at the writing desk in the small study off the main bedroom. Her study, a thing she still caught herself thinking with a slight sense of unreality, with a cup of tea going cold beside her and a letter half finished in front of her when she heard James in the corridor. She knew his footsteps the way mothers know these things, not by sound exactly, more by rhythm. The particular tempo of him, quick and purposeful, with a slight pause at the top of the stairs where he always stopped to look at the portrait on the landing. He had done this every morning since they arrived. Every morning he stood and looked at the late Duchess, Richard's mother, small and sharp-eyed and slightly amused. And every morning he stood there for precisely long enough that Marian suspected a conversation was taking place that she was not party to. She did not ask about it. Some things between a boy and his grandmother's portrait were private. He appeared in the doorway in his dressing gown, hair in its usual morning state of cheerful disorder, carrying something in both hands with the focused care of someone transporting an item of great significance. "Look," he said. He held it out. It was a beetle, a large one, glossy black, moving with considerable purpose across his palm. "James," Marian said, "I found it in the garden. It is 7 o'clock in the morning. I know I got up early." He looked at the beetle with the expression of a scientist assessing a significant find. "I think it's a ground beetle, a large one. Father will know." "Father," Marian said, "is still asleep." "No, he isn't." James looked up. "I already checked." Marian looked at her son. "You went into our bedroom at 7 o'clock in the morning to check whether your father was asleep." "I knocked," James said, with the air of someone who considers this to have fully addressed the relevant concern. "He wasn't there anyway. He's in the library." Marian closed her eyes briefly. "Of course he is," she said. She found him exactly where James had said, in the library, which at 7 in the morning was all gray light and cold air, the fire not yet lit, the Duke sitting at the desk with correspondence spread before him and a cup of tea that was also going cold. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. "You're up early," he said. "Your son woke me with a beetle." "Ah," he set down his pen. "Large, glossy. Apparently a ground beetle, apparently significant. He found one last week as well. He's been cataloging them. He has a system." Something in his voice, the particular warmth that James produced in it, that Marian had watched develop over the past year with an emotion she still sometimes struggled to name. "He made me a chart." "I know, he made me one also." "Ours are different charts." "Are they?" "Mine has more detail," he said, and he said it with precisely enough solemnity that she couldn't tell whether he was joking. She crossed the room and sat in the chair across from him, and he looked at her in the early morning light, plain dressing gown, hair not yet dressed, the particular unself-consciousness of a woman who no longer has to perform anything for anyone's benefit, and his expression did the thing it did sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching, the thing without a public name. "What are you writing?" she asked. "Letter to the solicitor, the new one." He paused. "The Wiltshire property is ready. The income is settled. My mother's bequest is it's done, finally. All of it transferred correctly." He looked at her carefully. "It's yours. It has been yours since the day she made the will. She simply never got the opportunity to ensure it reached you." Marian looked at the letter on the desk. Property in Wiltshire. An income. A dead woman's careful provision for a daughter-in-law she had met once, at a ball, and held the hand of and seen clearly. "She trusted you before you'd given her any particular reason to," Marian said. "She was like that. She decided things quickly and she was usually right." He paused. "She would have loved James. She would have found him completely insufferable and adored every moment of it." He laughed. A real laugh. The kind she had spent the better part of a year collecting evidence of, that it existed, that it came easily in the right conditions, that it was nothing like his public face and everything like the man underneath it. "Yes," he said, "exactly that." James appeared 20 minutes later, still in his dressing gown, beetle in hand, and installed himself in the armchair by the unlit fireplace with the ease of someone who has decided that a room is his and is waiting for the world to catch up. The Duke looked at the beetle. He identified it. He confirmed the chart classification. He asked 3 questions about where exactly in the garden it had been found, and James answered all 3 with the precision of a field naturalist, and the early morning light moved slowly across the library floor, and Marian drank her tea and watched them and did not try to name what she felt. Some things were too large for naming. Some things you simply sat inside. The wedding had been in March. Small Marian's insistence, and Richard had agreed without argument, which told her something about how thoroughly he had understood by then what she needed and what she didn't. Charlotte had cried, which was expected. Mrs. Graves had not cried, which was also expected, though Marian had caught her afterwards in the kitchen corridor, pressing her handkerchief to the corners of her eyes with great efficiency, and no acknowledgement that this was occurring. James had been ring-bearer. He had performed this role with immense seriousness and no incidents, which Marian considered one of the minor miracles of the year. And afterwards at dinner, he had eaten a quantity of cake that should not have been physically possible, and delivered his opinion of the ceremony to the assembled company with the confidence of a theater critic. It was good, he had said, short enough that nobody fell asleep, and the cake is excellent. The assembled company had laughed. The Duke of Ashford had looked at his son with an expression that Marian had filed away in the place where she kept the things she returned to when she needed them, her private collection, kept with more care than any beetle chart. In the summer, they had gone to Bath. Marian's idea, Richard had not understood immediately, and then had understood entirely and had said nothing except, "When would you like to go?" They had stayed a week. They had walked the streets she had walked alone in the years of being Miss Voss, and she had shown James the building where they had lived, and the park where she had taken him in his pram in the early mornings when she couldn't sleep, and the small shop where the woman behind the counter had always given him a biscuit without being asked. On the last afternoon, Richard had taken James to see the Roman baths. James had expressed, at length, his views on ancient Roman beetles and what they might have looked like, and the guide had been entirely unprepared for this. And Marian had sat alone on a bench in a quiet square and looked at the city she had survived and felt, for the first time, that she was not inside her own past anymore. She was outside it, looking at it clearly, with the distance that only comes when you have gotten far enough away. She had stayed on the bench for a long time. Then she had gone to find her husband and her son, who she located by following the sound of James explaining something at considerable volume to a man who was listening with every sign of genuine interest. She had stood at the edge of the square and watched them for a moment before they saw her. Just a moment, just long enough. Then James had spotted her and shouted her name across the square without the slightest self-consciousness, and she had walked toward them, and Richard had seen her face and offered his arm without a word, and the 3 of them had gone to find dinner, and the evening had been warm and ordinary and entirely sufficient. On the morning of their first anniversary, Marian came downstairs to find a single cream rose in a glass on the hall table. No card. She stood and looked at it for a long moment. Then she smiled, not the careful smile, not the measured one, not Miss Voss's smile, but the one that lived underneath all of that, the one she had been keeping safe for a long time, and she picked up the glass and carried it to the breakfast table. James was already there, bread in one hand, looking out the window at something in the garden with the focused attention of a boy who has found something of interest and is deciding whether it requires immediate action. "There's a very good beetle out there," he said without looking up. "Eat your breakfast first. What if it's gone by then? Then we'll find another one." James considered the philosophical implications of this. The Duke appeared in the doorway, looked at the rose on the table, looked at Marian and said nothing. He sat down. He poured his tea. He looked at his son, who was still monitoring the garden situation with considerable intensity, and his expression did the thing it did, the private thing, the one she kept in her collection. "Father," James said, still looking out the window, "how did you know Mama was the one?" A silence. Marian looked at her tea. The Duke looked at James, then at Marian, then out the window at the garden, where the morning was bright and the dew was still on the grass and the world was simply, straightforwardly itself. "She sat with the staff," he said, "at a dinner table full of people who should have known better, and she was the only queen in the room." James turned from the window. He looked at his father. He looked at his mother. He thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. "That's a good reason," he said. Then he looked back at the garden. "The beetle is still there," he said. "Can I go now?" "Finish your bread," Marian said. "Half of it. All of it." James ate his bread in 4 large, committed bites, stood up, pushed back his chair, and was out the garden door before it had fully closed behind him. The morning was quiet. The rose was cream-colored and just opened. The Duke reached across the table and covered Marian's hand with his, unhurried, certain, the gesture of a man who has stopped being careful with good things and started simply holding them. And outside in the garden James was crouching over something in the dewy grass, entirely absorbed, entirely himself. Marian turned her hand over and held his back. The morning light came through the east windows of Ashford House, the way it always did, early, unhurried, entirely sure of itself. She had learned by now to trust it. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.